So next, we're kind of looking at life history traits. And this is kind of take us from that idea of sexual reproduction and go a little bit further there. Um, so life history traits, there's three components to that. How essentially how an organism is born, lives, and dies. Okay, and how it goes through that. And so the model that we've created has these three components to it: growth, maintenance, and reproduction. So growth meaning how quickly do you reach an adult size, um, how long it takes, how big you are, all those things kind of fit into growth. Maturity, all of that's there. Okay. And then we have maintenance. This is essentially how long can you live? So how do you keep yourself alive long term? And then we have reproduction, which is how often do I reproduce? How many offspring do I have when I reproduce? And the idea is, after they came up with this model, is they said, well, why don't we see evolution favoring all three of these things at once? Why don't we see the hypothetical Darwinian demon, right? Something that is excellent at all of these aspects of life. And as you go through this lesson, hopefully you're able to see that the reason why is because environments aren't all the same. And life isn't predictable. If you have a high predation environment, waiting to reproduce could mean that you don't have any offspring at all before you're eaten. In that case, it's better to reproduce early in life. In contrast, if you have a low predator environment and you have very stable conditions, it's better to put off reproduction. And you can have members of a population get split into very locally, like geographically close, but very different systems due to things like predators or disease being present. And as a result, you can have very quickly, say, two streams with a type of fish in each stream that used to be one population. Now, all of a sudden, this fish, because it has a high predation factor in its environment, is going to be reproducing at very young ages and having very small overall sizes. And this group is going to reproduce later in life and get to be very large. And within just a few generations, depending on how strong that predation factor is, you can see a shift to where these species may not look similar at all and may reproduce at different times. And so this understanding that there is no ideal in these three factors, because environments are different, can help us understand how all of a sudden species form, right? Speciation takes place. And we'll come back to that later. But that was one of the big things, is that essentially we can't, there's a different answer for what's best depending on the environment. There was also another component to this, is that there seems to be trade-offs, right? That if you're going to maximize reproduction, you can't, for whatever reason, through biological constraints, right? The way that the organism grows and matures, it can't maximize growth if it's going to maximize reproduction. There's a trade-off to it. And so that's how they come up with this model, right? That's great and explains things. And then they come to this question of, well, why don't we see something doing great at all of these things? And that's when, well, we have to be able to explain why we don't see that. And that's where a lot of these experiments have come back to, is whenever one goes up, reproduction here or maintenance goes up, growth, the other comes down, right? So we have trade-offs in these in this model, and that best is what we think best explains the pattern of organisms, or in the case of the Darwinian demon, that we don't see. So the part I wanted to get to, talking about speciation, right? That there are ways that species become isolated, genetically isolated from one another. Now, if they're genetically the same, that means that they're part of one population and the members of that population are able to reproduce back and forth. It's called the biological species concept. They're able to uh, essentially breed back and forth and produce viable offspring. If they, as they're going through that process, or that population is going through, there's different ways that they can become isolated to the point where they can no longer reproduce with one another. So an example of that might be what we call behavioral isolation, that these two became separated for some reason. And at some point, this group on the left here starts having a different behavior, like maybe a song. Songs can be really important for mate selection in birds. This group is singing the song slightly differently than this group. And because of that, whenever they meet in their in-between zone, right? If they were ever to have individuals come across each other, they aren't singing the right song. And so they can become behaviorally isolated. Probably the most common way that groups can become genetically isolated is they are just physically in different geographic locations. And in that case, they can't reproduce, and differences, then all of a sudden they're on separate evolutionary paths. So we're thinking of this with like our evolutionary trees. This is the split, right? The population gets geographically isolated or behaviorally isolated. Another one is temporally isolated. And that fits kind of with what we were talking about with, like, in certain environments, it's better to reproduce early versus late. And in others, it's better to reproduce late than early. And in that case, right, you're going to not be able to reproduce because the females are not receptive at the same time. So an example of this might be like elk and deer, right? Elk here in Utah are in their reproductive stage, kind of late September, early October, whereas deer are in their reproductive phase in November, right? So because of that temporal isolation, those two groups are reproductively isolated. So these are all what we call pre-zygotic isolation. So before the organisms attempt to reproduce. There are others that are post-zygotic, right? So the sperm and egg can fuse together to form the zygote, but then the zygote is not viable. So it just will never, the developmental plans are so distinct that they won't ever form an organism. Sometimes they do form an organism and that organism is born. So a classic example of this, horse and a donkey reproduce to make a mule, but a mule is typically sterile, right? So hybrid sterility can result in these isolations. So this life history stuff is directly tied into how do these organisms develop these isolations, and a lot of it has to do with being in environments that have these different pressures. So